Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series examining the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 6 for Sunday, 9th of April 2017. And today we're talking about 3 movies, all portraying the events surrounding the mutiny aboard HMS Bounty in the South Pacific in 1789. The first is 1935's Mutiny on the Bounty, directed by Frank Lloyd, starring Charles Laughton as Captain Bligh and Clark Gable as Fletcher Christian. Second is 1962's Mutiny on the Bounty, directed by Lewis Milestone, with Trevor Howard as Captain Bligh and Marlon Brando as Fletcher Christian. And then, more recently, we have 1984's The Bounty, directed by David Lean, initially then completed by Roger Donaldson, with Anthony Hopkins as Bligh, Mel Gibson as Christian, and with a musical score by Vangelis. My name is Andrew Blischik, and with me as ever is Martin Darlington.
Hi everyone. First of all, we'd like to apologise for the late delivery of Dam Busters on iTunes last time out. This was my error. Now, my laptop had a personal issue with iTunes after I updated to 12.6. As it turned out, that was entirely coincidental as far as uploading the show went. I'd made a mistake, but I do have to pay tribute to the people at WordPress who host our site. We've had a couple of times where I've not been sure how to do something, or I've forgotten how to do something. And if anyone is interested in setting up a website, doing a podcast or a blog, I cannot recommend WordPress enough. Please believe me, they are not paying me to say this. They are so quick to support, really effective. You get onto live chat within a couple of minutes, and it was sorted out. Just really impressed. Got a little bit of listener feedback. Friend of the show, Gary Chavit, expressed his love of the Dam Busters movie, and we're relieved to report that he enjoyed our examination of it. In news, and really concentrating on this episode, because of the multi-movie focus of this, we're going to try yet another slightly different format. We're going to talk about the real events of each phase of the story first, and then talk about how each movie covered that incident or period, whether it was embellished, suppressed, or just changed. So don't worry, we'll make sure you know which bit we're talking about at each stage we get to, we hope.
If you do enjoy the show and want to support it through assisting with the costs of podcasting, you can donate by going to the About page of the website at www.historybyhollywood.com and hitting the Buy Now button. The costs of hosting are modest, and we happily accept them as part of the price of fulfilling our ambition for this podcast. One area we fail to anticipate, though, is in the research material. While the internet is very useful on sources, the material produced by those sources is generally in the form of a book, and quite understandably the authors of such material need to be paid for their efforts. So we're having to buy quite a lot of books or download them onto Kindles, and we continue to refuse to rely on Wikipedia and articles of unknown provenance. Thank you, and without further ado, here is the show.
So first of all, we're just going to look at the sources we've used for information. William Bligh's own published account is available on Kindle for free, and it understandably concentrates on his incredible voyage after the mutiny, which we'll obviously get to. There's also The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of HMS Bounty by Sir James Barrow. It was written in 1831, and he was a secretary to the Admiralty, writing about 40 years after the events that he was portraying. It's one of the early, slightly, I think, biased accounts, but we'll get to that later, in which way it's biased. There's also James Morrison's account. He was a sailor aboard the Bounty, and he got left behind. He couldn't fit in the boat, but he wrote an account. He was clearly an educated man. He could read and write. And we also have the court-martial records, which are fascinating to read, and these are the actual transcripts, and in some cases with additional bits put in by the judge advocate. The main book I've really been ploughing through recently in the last stages of the research is The Bounty by Caroline Alexander. I think the full title is The Bounty, the true story of the Mutiny of 1789. It is a thoroughly researched publication. It was published in 2003, and it sheds a lot of new light through the author's meticulous research into both official documents but also personal letters of the mutineers and the loyal survivors and the relatives back in England of some of those who never actually came back.
Okay, so in addition to the legitimate historical sources, we also, of course, relied on the three movies that portray the events on the Bounty. There was an earlier, the first of which is from 1935, called Mutiny on the Bounty. There is an earlier Australian movie that starred Errol Flynn just a couple of years before that, but that's fallen off the radar, and you probably couldn't download that or find that anywhere. So let's start with the 1935 movie, Mutiny on the Bounty. It's a Hollywood movie directed by Frank Lloyd and starring Charles Lawton as Captain Bligh and heartthrob Clark Gable as Fletcher Christian. It's based on a fictionalised novel of the same name that came out just before the movie was made in 1933. The movie was a big hit at the time, taking nearly $5 million and the 1935 Best Picture Oscar. It has a 94% positive rating on Rotten Tomatoes and runs for just over 2 hours. It was filmed on site in Tahiti and in California.
The next one we got is the 1962 Mutiny on the Bounty. It was also a Hollywood movie, this time done in Technicolor, directed by Lewis Milestone, who was already a 2-time Best Director Oscar winner. The headline stars were Trevor Howard as the captain and Marlon Brando as Christian. It's based on the same fictionalised novel as the 1935 film, which was written by Charles Nordhoff and James Norman Hall. Unlike its predecessor, though, it was seen as a commercial failure, as it cost some $19 million to make. It's a lot of money in 1962, and it only took $14 million at the box office. The reviews were generally negative, mainly due to Brando's performance in general and his rather changeable British accent. It was nominated for 7 Oscars, but it won none. It runs for exactly 3 hours and was filmed mainly on site in the South Pacific.
And that brings us to the third of the three movies, the 1984 film simply titled The Bounty. It's a 1984 Hollywood movie based on another fictionalised novel, 1972's Captain Bligh and Mr. Christian by Roger Howe. It's directed by New Zealander Roger Donaldson and stars Anthony Hopkins as Bligh and Mel Gibson as Christian. It's seen as the most historically accurate of the three movies, and it was a critical success, but again a financial failure, costing some $25 million to make and taking only $9 million at the box office. It runs for 2 hours and 12 minutes and was filmed on site in the UK and the South Pacific.
So first of all, we'll just have a quick introduction to both the characters and the period. Just to set the scene, this fairly isolated incident has captured imaginations over the centuries, but there were some hugely significant events taking place at this time around the world. Now, as we're going to come to shortly, Bligh had sailed with Captain Cook, the famous exploring naval Captain Cook, on his third and final South Pacific exploration. That set sail in July 1776. Any American listeners will realise the significance of that date immediately, because on the 4th of July that year, the American states declared their independence. The mutiny on the Bounty occurred in April 1789, and, well, we're just coming up to the 228th anniversary in a couple of weeks' time.
28th of April?
So in July of the same year, the storming of the Bastille occurred in Paris, often seen as the real start of the French Revolution. So to the rest of the world, what occurred on a ship that was so small it was classed as a cutter on the other side of the world from Europe was really of no consequence. The years in between the voyage with Cook and from that voyage, Bligh didn't return to England until 1880.
1780.
Sorry, 1780.
Yeah.
Thank you. And between that and the departure of the Bounty, saw him spend some time in merchant service and some as a half-pay lieutenant, because peace had broken out across most of Europe and with the infant USA. This also explains what can appear to us as blatant self-promotion by Bligh and many of his contemporaries, because they were urgently trying to secure the next commission and hopefully promotion along with it.
Okay, so Lieutenant William Bligh, age 23, was chosen by Captain James Cook to sail with him as the ship's navigator. He was present when Cook was killed by hostile islanders on, I think, what became Hawaii?
Yeah, the Friendly Isles, as they were called then.
Okay.
Yeah, not very friendly.
No. So there's little doubt that Bligh had skills as an exceptional navigator, a talent that he would prove during the fateful voyage of the Bounty. At the time of the Bounty sailing, he was appointed as captain and he was only 34 years old. It's worth noting that he's referred to throughout the movies and popular culture as Captain Bligh, but this was a courtesy of the commander of a ship. His actual rank was lieutenant, and he was appointed to command the breadfruit mission. He had assumed that this would include after that a promotion legitimately to captain. So once it became clear that the ship bought for the mission was the Bounty, a purchased merchant vessel that didn't even qualify as a sloop, and that the mission would take 2 years, Bligh knew that his rank would not change for at least that period. Okay, the other major character in the movies and in history is, of course, Fletcher Christian. He was from a good family, a patrician family, and had connections that had set him up, but clearly he also had an adventurous spirit. He'd sailed with Bligh before, and they were friends, Christian being 10 years younger than Bligh. Bligh clearly was not what we call today a man manager. Like a lot of military officers of the period, he seemed to have taken it as an article of faith that sailors or soldiers would obey faithfully because that was their duty, and that he should have to make no special consideration of feelings, well-being or morale beyond ensuring the crew was effective. Bligh had, however, studied Cook's techniques to maintain a healthy ship, and not only was Bligh fastidious about the ship's cleanliness, but also about his men. Hand washing before eating, a diet to avoid scurvy, and mandatory dancing each evening were all measures that Cook had employed to great effectiveness, and Bligh copied Cook as closely as he could.
Yeah, and it's interesting that all three movies use this fastidious, pernickety nature, or that's how they portray it, of Bligh almost using the cleanliness of a ship and the dancing especially as kind of a form of bullying, where actually the motivation behind it was sound. And I mean, he was horrified when they arrived in Tahiti because they lost a sailor on the way.
Yeah.
It was actually probably down to the surgeon's incompetence, but
and
we'll get to that.
Leeching and stuff.
Yeah, bloodletting, which they seem to let the bad humours out as medicine at that time seemed to think.
And the doctor, in the historical record, blames that single death on scurvy.
Yes.
Which he's just covering his tracks is the perceived wisdom, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the reason that the Americans call Brits limeys is because we were famous for eating limes, and they thought it was funny, not realising, as a lot of the seafaring nations didn't at the time.
And Cook is credited with discovering the link between lack of scurvy.
Francis Drake, actually, yeah, and 100 years plus beforehand. And the cocktail, the mojito, comes from... the problem they had was getting sailors to drink lemon juice or lime juice. So they mixed it with a rum ration, put sugar or later on molasses in it.
There you go.
And stirred it up and said, if you want your rum ration, that's how you're taking it. So it was a really clever, sneaky way. And it used to be called an Il Draco, which was the Spanish nickname for Drake. Just a little historical aside.
Great.
So next time you drink a mojito, you can rest assured that scurvy will be held off for a while. Looking back at the movies, they really do use, and the dancing in the 84 movie especially, it's seen as this
bizarre,
making the men humiliate themselves, and the other thing that's interesting is naval records show that Bligh was certainly not a tyrannical disciplinarian. He deployed the lash much less than many other naval officers at the time. It is apparent, though, he was quite an abrasive character. He would fly off the handle at times, and he had no qualms about reprimanding officers and petty officers in front of the crew, which is generally seen as poor management.
Well, the first two movies go out of their way to say he was a tyrant and a sadist and unhinged, and, it's just worth mentioning the very first movie, the 35 with Charles Lawton. They've invented some guy that struck his officer, and before they even leave Portsmouth, the Lawton character, Bligh character, says, let's flog this man to show the crew who's in control. The man is pronounced dead, And so Bligh says, what the heck, flog him anyway, give him 24 lashes. And this is before they even set sail. And so there's already a death that's inaccurate in the first movie, setting the scene for what a tyrant he was. And, that's no service to history, the way they portrayed him.
No. Charles Lawton plays it brilliantly.
He?
He was Hollywood royalty at the time, wasn't he? But
yeah,
he must have enjoyed playing the character. But he is slightly pantomime villain, isn't he?
Yeah, that's right.
To a degree, so is Trevor Howard, I think, in the 62 film. The other thing that they have, and certainly the 84 film does it subtly, but the incident of the coconuts, which we'll cover in a bit more detail later, has Captain Bligh, or Lieutenant Bligh, referring to them as his personal store. And certainly this seems to be portrayed that he considered the ship's provisions as personal property, and would fly into a rage when he believed that food had been stolen or wasted. And now, this might have been the fact that the ship was too small to accommodate a purser. Now, a purser was very lowly paid, but he was basically like an army quartermaster. His job was to distribute food, and before a voyage set sail, he'd be given a budget by the Admiralty to secure provisions, load them on board ship. The deal was, anything that didn't get used, he could sell at the end of the voyage and keep the profit. So all sailors would immediately view pursers who said, no, that's your ration, you can't have any more, as, yeah, you're just lining your own pockets. So pursers were universally despised. But they couldn't fit a purser on board the Bounty. Yeah. So Captain or Lieutenant Bligh acted as the purser. So I don't think he would necessarily have been worried about making profit, although he worried about income. He had a family to support, and he did worry about money. But he lent money. He lent money to Fletcher Christian on a voyage down, so he wasn't a miser.
Just on that lending the money, that was en route in one of the
ports.
They
stopped at the Cape of Good Hope.
Yeah, why? It's really bizarre to think, why would Christian need money in a port like that?
Wine, women and song, I'm not sure. Yes. They did stop there for 2 or 3 weeks whilst they repaired the ship. But again, we're jumping ahead a little bit. But yeah, it is strange. Why would you? Because you've been fed. You're on board,
well, but just to return to the purser thing, that you think that when you say that Bligh would have been the acting as the purser for the trip, in the first 2 movies they make a big deal of the fact that he was corrupt and had his fingers in the till and making the men eat less or drink less so that he could line his own pocket. That's a really big message in the first 2 movies. And clearly I think they may have taken a bit of license with that one, that's for sure.
Yeah, now they're probably basing it on some of the accounts that came from both loyalists who went with Bligh in the open boat voyage, which we'll get to later, and captured mutineers alleged that that Captain Bligh was lining his own pockets, that he would take coconuts for his own personal use or to stash away for later profit, and then accuse people of stealing them. Yeah. But it was very much in these people's interest to make sure that Bligh was portrayed as a tyrant. Not so much the loyalists, but when they got to court-martial and were actually given sworn evidence, very few of these accusations actually made the light of day. So, yeah, interesting. Now, another point is the surgeon, Dr. Huggan. In reality, before they left England, Bligh realised that his surgeon was an alcoholic, and during the voyage a couple of times he'd have his cabin searched whilst the doctor was busy doing something else, and they couldn't find where he was stashing it, but he seemed to be able to get drunk most of the time. He did manage to get a assistant surgeon on board, a chap called Thomas Ledward, or Peter Ledward, we'll get to him later anyway, because Bligh had no faith in Huggan.
And both of the earlier movies, I think all 3 movies portray Huggan as a drunk.
Absolutely, yeah.
The first movie, for some reason, doesn't call him Huggan, calls him Dr. Bacchus, and they make him a real comic figure. But
here we are again with the like Senator Gracchus in Gladiator.
Well, if you want to portray a drunk
Bacchus
doctor,
being the god of drink,
wine,
god of wine, yeah. Amongst the rest of the crew, there was John Fryer, who's listed as master, which means navigator, and Fletcher Christian employed as the master's mate. They were treated as officers, but in actual fact they were listed as warrant officers, which means that Lieutenant Bligh is the only commissioned officer on board, and that is significant, or becomes significant later on. There are also a number of young gentlemen who, whilst listed as able seamen, were really employed as midshipmen or apprentice officers. Some of them were very young and on their first voyages, and amongst them were two characters that certainly the 84 movie combined into one character. There was Matthew Haywood, spelled Hay, and Peter Haywood, spelled Hey. Peter Haywood was a minor aristocrat from the Isle of Man, and he's the inspiration for the 1932's fictional midshipman Roger Byam, who plays quite a key role in that movie, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. And I'm not sure. I was trying to wonder why they would bother to change the name from Haywood to Byam, but because they're pretty faithful in that movie to what Haywood really was. Peter Haywood, in that movie, he starts to collate a dictionary of Tahitian English dictionary. And the real Peter Haywood did something very similar, And then I was reading that when the journey commenced, the real Peter Haywood was 15 years old. So maybe they got a new name to kind of make him more worldly. Not sure. Okay, so let's start the journey then, according to the movies. The first two movies start with the commencement of the voyage from Portsmouth. And the third movie is like a retelling in flashback from a court-martial after the event. Yeah,
this was the court-martial that saw Bligh being court-martialed to determine whether he was at fault for the loss of his ship.
So the first movie, 1935, shows Clark Gable bursting into a tavern and rounding up every eligible male of the right age and press-ganging them into service on the Bounty. Now, that's particularly inaccurate. The people on the Bounty would have all been, His Majesty's sailors and professionals.
And we were at peace with France. And although technically we were still at war with the United States, there was no active conflict continuing except on a very small scale. So there were a lot of out-of-work sailors. They'd have had no trouble filling that ship at all.
And the other thing I wonder whether they decided to use the device of press-ganged men, like reluctant participants on the ship, to further the tension that they wouldn't have their hearts into this job, that they weren't professional sailors, they weren't, a mutiny by somebody that's forced to be on a ship versus a mutiny by someone who's a professional career sailor is going to be very different, and it lessens the impact maybe.
Certainly, yeah. And it's more, if they want to make it the audience sympathetic to the mutineers, the fact that someone will press ganged will certainly help that.
So that's a big mark against the first one, 1935, I guess.
Yeah. 62 doesn't show that.
No.
So they're far more accurate. But I do think that this is where the 84 film, and it's a wonderful film, I think. I remember watching it not long after it came out, obviously one of the few people who did, if it lost so much at the box office. But they actually do show Bligh taking Fletcher Christian out for dinner, telling him about this commission he's got, and he said, look, I can't bring you on, but I don't have the establishment for officers, but would you like to come as master's mate? And Fletcher Christian, without hesitation, is like, yes, William, and they clink glasses, and they're shown as the friends they were, and it's absolutely true.
To the truth. What else at the start of the journey? I mean, we get established pretty quickly in the 35 one that Bligh is seen as a tyrant.
We mentioned about the flogging the dead man,
and even before the press gang members learn that Bligh's going to be their captain, they're quaking in their boots. And similar with 62. 35 suggests that Bligh's been a captain for a long time and he's a tyrant.
Yeah.
Then 62, Trevor Howard's Bligh says that this is his first commission as captain. So they're trying to portray two very different things, and the reality was somewhere in between. I mean, yes, it was Bligh's first appointment to captain a naval vessel, but he'd been captain of merchant vessels many times before. So was it his first go at captain? Yes and no.
I suppose it was his first independent Royal Naval Command.
And coming from the merchant world, he would have had a significant drop in pay, wouldn't he, for the prestige of sailing for His Majesty?
Because during his merchant service, he was still a Royal Naval commissioned officer, but he was granted leave of absence because they just didn't have enough work for them.
Right.
So they're on half pay, which was apparently barely survivable for a lieutenant.
Yeah.
So he'd gone to a relative, and they were running to the West Indies and back for sugar, I suppose.
Okay, so the real story is he was a fairly noble character. He was doing the right thing, taking a drop in pay to do what he perceived as a noble voyage around the world.
Yeah. The nobility of the actual purpose is questionable. It was all sponsored by Joseph Banks, who was a naturalist who'd been off with Cook on 2 of his voyages, his first 2. And Kew Gardens is in London, the Botanical Gardens is largely due to Joseph Banks, very influential figure.
I don't know if you know this, but he's a bit of a hero in Australia.
Joseph Banks?
Yeah, he's on the $5 note, for example.
Right, well that's Botany Bay is from Joseph Banks.
Yeah, he named it, the first landing site in Australia.
But he sponsored this, and the idea was to go to Tahiti, pick up these breadfruit plants, transport them to the West Indies to provide a cheap and nourishing staple food for the plantation slaves.
Yeah.
So looking back now with a modern perspective, it's a fairly horrible thing to be undertaking, but of course at the time he's a naval officer, he's been given a task, and he just wants to carry it out. And
I wondered if the early movies particularly might have sort of glossed over the whole slave connection, but they do, try and portray their voyage as noble with saying that they're going to be doing a good thing for the world, but they definitely do make it clear that it's to feed slaves in the Caribbean. Yeah, and 84's The Bounty, even has Bligh making a little aside joke to, because Fletcher Christian says, what's the purpose? And he tells him it's to feed the slaves. He said, apparently bananas are terribly expensive. Almost as if they're laughing at the merchants who want these guys to sail round the world just so they can make a bit more profit. So you can interpret that whichever way you like. So we're spending a lot of time on setting the scene for the departure in the open oceans, but just before we go there, I just want to make one comment about the 62 movie and the arrival of Fletcher Christian / Marlon Brando. Yeah, it's the most over-the-top, ridiculous thing. It's portrayed. He comes out of a carriage with 2 French ladies on one on each arm. He's like a cross between. He's dressed like a cross between a leprechaun and a superhero. He's got the buckled hat on his head. He's got a red cape, and he talks with some kind of strange, affected British accent. It is hilarious. The first few minutes of that, just for Brando's appearance, and it's almost set in a scene that he's a playboy. Yeah, or that he's a lightweight, a fop. Yeah. And he hardens up. At the end of the film, he's tough enough to take on Bligh and win. Yeah. Okay, so the reality was the plan was always for them to go down to the Canary Islands and touch at Tenerife, which the ship did, from where the last letters were sent. In fact, no, sorry, they went to the Cape of Good Hope later, didn't they? But Bligh certainly sent letters back to Joseph Banks and his wife, and those letters have been preserved. And the plan was then to go round the Cape Horn. Let's just pause then, because you get confused, because the ship does attempt to go to one cape and then across the other. Yeah. It was originally heading for Cape Horn, which is the tip of South America. Because that would shorten the journey by 10,000 miles. But it is. As soon as I saw that on the map on the first movie, I'm thinking, what are they doing going sailing west? That's against the trade winds, which come from the west to east. But there must be certain times of the year when it's worth trying. This is one of the problems that Bligh sat in Spithead of Portsmouth for 3 weeks waiting for his sailing orders. Why the Admiralty did it the way they did, and his window of opportunity, the weather window, to get round the Horn before the winter gales, or the summer gales as they are in the southern hemisphere, it was shrinking. And he watched all his ships sailing off down the channel with favourable winds. When his orders finally did come, the winds had turned to the prevailing southwesterly, and they couldn't get out of the channel. And they were going between Spithead and the Isle of Wight and Spithead for another 2 or 3 weeks. So very, very frustrating. But in his journal, he just seems to accept it as the exigencies of service. So eventually they do set off. They're very late by now. Sailing west-southwest or southwest. Stop at Tenerife. Try the Horn, and they do try for a couple of weeks to get round, and they are battered by storms. And eventually they give up and turn east and sail around the Cape of Good Hope, which is the tip of South Africa. And they stop there for a couple of 2 or 3 weeks to repair and replenish. Well, Well, the 35 movie doesn't really mention the fact that they tried to go around Cape Horn and were unsuccessful and had to turn tail and head 180 degrees the opposite direction. It's this crazy graphic that shows the map of the world with them going towards South America and then zigzagging back and forward and then suddenly turning around, and the map tracks off to the right, to the east.
Without
explanation.
Yeah.
And then the 35 one makes... the 62 one makes a big deal of this, saying that Bligh was somehow motivated to go in the wrong direction because he wanted to complete a personal triumph of a circumnavigation of the globe.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether that's...
No, they were his orders. His orders were to go to Cape Horn.
But the movies tries to suggest that the reason they were going that way was because he wanted to then pick up the breadfruit and come in the same direction and complete a Magellan circumnavigation of the world.
Yeah, which is actually the exact opposite of what his orders were to go there via Cape Horn, but come back via the Cape of Good Hope.
There you go.
But his orders did allow him I think we've just had some cat sound effects. But his orders did allow him, in the event of being unsuccessful at rounding the Horn, to turn east and go via the Cape of Good Hope.
Yeah, and there is the suggestion in at least the 62 movie that this was him coming up with this himself, but they had orders to sail west, and if that doesn't work, you've got permission to turn around and go east.
Yeah, and the 84 film made quite a big deal of the desperate efforts to get around the Horn. Yeah. But it is worth remembering, he didn't lose a man. He did not lose a man at that stage. Then they go to the Cape of Good Hope, and then they sail off towards the South Pacific. By the time they arrive at Tahiti, they've sailed 28,000 miles. It's just absolutely staggering. So what we need to look at now is the first signs of trouble. First of all, in reality, and then we'll look at how the different movies start to portray the conflict, the growing conflicts aboard the ship. In reality, on the voyage to Tahiti, they were anchored off Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, and Bligh, this is quite true, had a run-in with the ship's carpenter, William Purcell. Now, Purcell was accused by Bligh, who came ashore to see what he was doing, that he was collecting inferior wood and he was cutting the logs too long to fit in the ship's launch to get out to the ship. Purcell answered back and refused to apologise, so Bligh sent him back to the ship, where the carpenter then had crossed words with Mr. Fryer, the ship's master, played in the 84 film by Daniel Day-Lewis, and an early role, played very well. Now, Bligh had grounds to court-martial Purcell, but without any other commissioned officers, he wouldn't be able to convene a court-martial for at least a year. So he'd have to keep Purcell locked up, and he'd lose his skills as a carpenter, he'd lose his skills as just an able-bodied seaman. But equally...
I don't think... Is the confrontation with Purcell mentioned in the 84?
No.
Well, that's not in any of the films then.
No.
I think they brushed that out.
And this was quite genuine, but it does have a possible bearing on later on. Because Purcell was ranked as a warrant officer, he couldn't be flogged.
Right.
So Bligh actually had his hands terribly tied. He had a bit of a Hobson's choice here. And he came up with what he, in his personal log, he kept an official naval log and also a private log. And he's quite pleased with himself. He says, okay, Purcell, no punishment, but you're not being given any provisions until you go back to work and get on with your job. And actually it worked, because Purcell would have starved. So, and Bligh did say anybody giving him food would be severely punished. So it's possible that some of the warrant officers and the men noticed that Bligh didn't have a whole range of disciplinary options open to him. Uh-huh. He could flog a man, but not a warrant officer. He gave him a little bit of licence, possibly.
Okay, so that's the first sign of trouble. So then they leave. That was South Africa, yeah. That was
off Tasmania.
Oh, right.
Van Diemen's Land,
of course. So we're getting close now to Tahiti.
Yeah, well, they arrive in Tahiti, 15-month voyage, 28,000 miles, as we said. And the greetings are pretty much accurate in all the films, although the third film actually shows the Tahitian women as they would have been seen: grass skirts, bare tops, garlands around their heads.
62 comes pretty close for 62 to doing that. There's lots of discreetly placed hair over the chest, but lots of shots from behind clearly show that these ladies are topless, which would have been a bit risque in 62. In the 35 movie, there is a slight moment of tension between the Tahitians and Bligh, and you, as the audience, you don't know whether it's going to go, but it quickly all turns to chummy, and they're greeted with open arms in all three films.
Yeah, and it's interesting. 84 film has William Bligh landing, being recognised from his visit there with Cook, which apparently is quite true. And the king is still the same king. And he. But they ask him about Cook. Now, some historical records say that they'd already been told that Captain Cook was dead, and they are very sad because they have a portrait of him. They almost revere him as a almost godlike figure. But in the film, they have Bligh saying, "No, he's absolutely fine. Yeah, he's very healthy and sends his regards."
Yeah, both the first two films they do that. They suggest that he's holding back on Cook's death to influence the Tahitians and saying he's alive and sends his greetings.
Yeah. So what the truth is there, we're not quite sure. But there's also one account that says Fletcher Christian introduced William Bligh to the king as this is Captain Cook's son, which they probably didn't take literally, especially as the king and a number of other senior Tahitians recognised Bligh from his earlier visit, because as ship's master, as the navigator, he'd have been with Cook, going ashore, meeting them.
Well, conveniently for the narrative, I'm not sure about 84, but definitely the earlier two films have the king that remembers Bligh having learnt English from the earlier visit, so they can have a dialogue very easily in Hollywood style without pointing or gesturing or translators or anything. So what about 84? 84's the same? Did it have the king speaking English?
Yeah, he speaks English, quite good English as well.
So I don't know how accurate that is, but
they do show Bligh very stiff-necked in his full dress uniform, and then they start gathering the breadfruit,
which the Tahitians are very happy to provide. In the 62 movie, they say they need 1,000. I don't know if we've got an exact number in this.
It was just over 1,000 that they took with them. When were put on board the ship, and they had gifts to give to the Tahitians in response. What is apparent is historically Fletcher Christian was put in charge of the shore party. Now, Lieutenant Bligh, being a good naval captain, liked to sleep aboard his ship, so he was there if there was any trouble. So each evening he'd go back to the ship, at which point the men ashore were pretty much left unsupervised, other than by Fletcher Christian. Now, the 84 film, it basically becomes love story of him and this young Tahitian girl courting each other and swimming in pools and all this as Bligh becomes increasingly frustrated by what he sees as the indolent lifestyle his men are indulging in. Yeah,
I mean, they make a big play in all the movies that the Tahitians are very open-minded and not repressed about sex, and they're all multiple wives, multiple partners, seems to be okay, and that kind of image was confirmed by the writings of Margaret Mead many years later, and there has been some doubt cast on her methods, that she might have overstated the open-minded lovemaking of some of her subjects, but this all three movies fit the mould of that sort of Margaret Mead, South Pacific, open-minded, taking lovers approach.
And of course one of the things we imported there, apart from gunpowder and metal tools and trinkets, was venereal disease. The Tahitians say the French brought it, the French say the British brought it, the British obviously say the French brought it. It doesn't really matter who brought it first, it would have turned up there as soon as Europeans started going, and it became horrific. I
read somewhere that the drunk doctor, Hagen, inspected all the men before they interacted with the Tahitians and declared them all venereal disease free, which...
Well, on the ship's log, both midshipman Peter Hayward and Fletcher Christian were treated for the venereal.
Before they landed?
No. During the 5 months. Because they were brought on shore at Tahiti. Now, this is the setback of the late departure, not getting round the Horn. They were meant to have landed 2 months, load the breadfruit, go. but they've actually got there during the Tahitian rainy season, so it takes them 5 months before they can actually harvest the breadfruit and put them on board in the captain's cabin, which had been converted to a nursery for the bread plants, or the breadfruit plants.
Well, just while we're talking about the relationships between the Tahitians and the Brits, it's just a little interesting aside, is that in the 62 movie, Christian has an affair with the daughter of the Tahitian king, and the actress that played the daughter, a character named Mamiti, is a French Polynesian actress called Terita Teripai, who went on to become the future Mrs. Marlon Brando. So after their on-screen romance, it became a real-life romance.
The 84 as well shows Fletcher Christian's romance with a daughter of the king.
Yeah.
And it is quite movingly portrayed, but there is an element of, okay, you are deliberately plucking our heartstrings here, quite blatantly.
And the 35 one also has a romance with the Tahitian daughter of the king, and the way they sort of gloss over that is they have some form of marriage towards the end of the movie, and they have a child, cherub-like child born of the union, sort of, I don't know, justifying...
Whilst they're still there.
Yeah.
That's a very, very short gestation period that girl underwent.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That could have been at the end of Pitcairn, I think. No, they don't do Pitcairn in that one. They just have a rousing speech about how men won't live with tyrants. Anyway.
So, back to reality. A few months into their stay, Charles Churchill, portrayed in the 84 film by Liam Neeson, he was the master at arms. John Millwood and William Muspratt deserted. They took several muskets and ammunition. Bligh demanded from the islanders they assist in recapturing them, and they did indeed, as actually portrayed in the 84 film. They came upon them, arrested them. Now, he could have put them for court-martial, which would almost certainly have ended up in them being executed. He decided not to do that, but he had them flogged. Churchill, for some reason, only gets 12 lashes. The other two, 24. The standard for desertion of the day would be 100 to 150 lashes if you weren't hanged.
Well, all three movies then portray that little desertion towards the end of the stay in Tahiti. Yeah. And I think
it's as they realise they're about to leave, they decide they don't want to.
Yeah, they're recaptured very easily in the first two, very soon, not 3 weeks, well under that. And the second one, 62, has got the Tahitians helping them detain these deserters, and they are flogged in each one of the movies. So we've already mentioned the fact that they had a 5-month stay, enjoying the good life in Tahiti. That's true in 84 and 62. For some reason, the 35 movie with Charles Lawton pretty much just shows them arriving, loading the breadfruit, and then sailing off to Mutiny.
And it's strange that, because having read about it, clearly Bligh himself described Tahiti as probably as close to a paradise-like perfection as you'll find on this earth. Friendly people, bountiful fruit, food, and water, wildlife, wonderful weather. It was that stay, and the idea we're now going to go back and sail all the way back to England, to the hard work of being a professional naval seaman again, possibly back to a war, we don't know, because they seem to crop up frequently in those days.
Well, we haven't, our potted history along the way, we haven't yet gotten to the mutiny, but we're now discussing the period of the gestation time of the mutiny, when they were 5 months in this paradise. And then all the narratives, the history books, the fiction, the three movies, they kind of juggle with the reason for the mutiny. And the Hollywood side of the story is that Bligh was a tyrant and that they were mutinying against him personally.
It was a blow for freedom.
Yeah, whereas, in reality, I think the 84 one plays this pretty well, is that they sailed away from paradise back to their real world and
didn't like it
and wanted to go back.
Yeah.
And which is the exact motivation? It'll be a combination of both, but I think Hollywood pretty much has overplayed Bligh, the tyrant, as the main culprit.
Definitely. The three deserters slipped off the ship from where they went on Matthew Haywood, the Hay character midshipman. It was his watch, and Bligh reduced him to the rank, sent him before the mast in naval terms, as punishment for that, and he was confined for I think a month. But we get the breadfruit loaded on board, and it's clear that the ship's about to leave. When they do leave, in reality, the plan was always to sail up between New Guinea and what was then called New Holland, now Australia, through the Endeavour Strait and chart the Barrier Reef. Captain Cook had run aground there. So part of Bligh's brief was to go via Endeavour Strait, then Cape of Good Hope, tip of South Africa again, and then cross the Atlantic to the West Indies.
So they're turning tail and they're sailing back in a westerly direction.
Yes.
Northwest and then eventually west.
That's right. And the 84 film, and this is where they really do depart from reality, it might be the most historically accurate, but that doesn't make it historically accurate, have him saying, right lads, I've come to a decision and you're going to remember this for the rest of your lives. We're going to do the horn again. And of course that's a huge thing of, hang on a second, we nearly died the first time, now you want to do that again? And actually that's absolutely made up.
Really?
Yeah, there's no suggestion at all that he was going to go back and do the horn. But again, it would be an emotional motivation to, I'll sod that. Not only am I got to leave paradise behind, I'm probably going to die.
Yeah. So we're set sail from Tahiti, and obviously the mutiny is now imminent.
Yeah, I mean, it was they set sail on the 5th of April 1789, in truth this is, and there were a number of incidents which kick off the incident of the coconuts, portrayed in the 84 film, quite openly, quite honestly I think, quite accurately, except to have Bligh referring to it as his personal store. And he'd have had his personal store in his cabin. He wouldn't have had them up on deck. That was the ship's store. And Fletcher Christian says, I had one, I was thirsty, I thought it was no consequence. And Bligh absolutely flips. What we haven't seen in any of the movies is the backstory of Bligh repeatedly telling Christian that even though he's in charge of the shore party, he has to keep the men under naval discipline, and clearly he hadn't.
Well, I remember the 35 movie definitely has got the accusation of missing coconuts. I think the Marlon Brando 62 one did as well, but I'm not 100% certain on that one. But, clearly in at least 2, if not 3 of the movies, the coconuts and Christian being accused of either taking them or not supervising them and someone else taking them on his watch is a big narrative point towards the mutiny. They
also landed on an inhabited island and to collect water and any yams or coconuts they could find. Fletcher Christian commanded the shore party. They were confronted by some reasonably hostile locals, and they basically ran for the boats and came back to the ship. And this is factual, and I don't think this was portrayed in any of the movies. And in front of the men, Bligh accuses Fletcher Christian of cowardice. And he said, "You were armed. You should have stood up, put a front up. We know from experience, or he knew from experience, that confronted by disciplined men with firearms, the locals weren't stupid, and they would have said, okay, that didn't work." But he said, all you've done is now made them very confident. We can't go back there for water.
So where was Bligh when the landing?
Bligh was on board the ship, and they sent 1 or 2 of the ship's boats ashore, and they were confronted by the locals, and basically they ran, and they collected some water and some food, but nowhere near what was required or what they'd been told to. And Bligh accuses Christian of cowardice, but then invites him to dine with him that night, and this is for the first time Fletcher Christian declines the invitation.
Okay, so things are souring, that's for sure.
It's funny that the actual mutiny itself, there are various versions depending who you believe, and of course the one account we've been deprived of is Fletcher Christian himself.
Yeah, we'll get to that, I guess.
The sequence of events, in truth, is hard to tell. Some accounts say that Christian was trying to make a raft, and he was just going to try and float off to an island and island hop his way back to Tahiti, because they're nearly 3.5 weeks outbound from Tahiti. So they're a good distance away.
Yeah, it's very unlikely they'd think that.
Yeah, and then he was persuading people, going, "What are you doing? Look, obviously we're not going to stop you, but why don't you just take the ship?" Caroline Alexander, in an excellent book, has sifted and sifted and said the one common denominator of names encouraging to take him is George Stewart, who's one of the young gentlemen acting as a midshipman, although he didn't actually bear the official rank. George Stewart comes up over and over and over again as, sometimes it's him and Peter Hayward, sometimes it's Charles Churchill, the Master at Arms who'd been flogged for desertion, and George Stewart, but it's always George Stewart.
Well, 62, it's the sailors that are needling Bligh, including Churchill. He's the biggest protagonist that's needling him. But so there were people that were prompting him to do it, whether they were midshipmen / officers or the common sailors. The movies tend to make it common sailors.
It is clear that Fletcher Christian was probably the most popular officer on board, but having been a soldier, and I'm sure sailors are no different, often the popular officer is the one you want to be commanded by because he's lax. When you're actually doing a serious job, you want an efficient, effective officer.
That's true.
And they're not always the nicest people, as we see with Bligh. But so when they say popular about Christian, it doesn't mean he was good. It just means that they could get away with stuff.
Probably. So it's April 28th, 1789, and you'll say that the mutineers wake up Captain Bligh with the news that they want to take the ship.
Yeah, it's Christian, Charles Churchill, John Mills and Thomas Burkitt, and that's all agreed that they've gone to... Well, that's right, Fletcher Christian had been the officer of the deck, early hours of the morning, and they'd spotted a shark. So anyone who wasn't involved in this conspiracy, whether it had been planned for days, weeks, or had been snapped up on a matter of minutes, what are you going to the armoury? I'm getting a musket to shoot a shark.
Right.
And Peter Hayward claimed that he said, "Oh right, I'll get the shark hook." So they had a big shark gaff that if they wounded it could get alongside, they could hook it up, because they get a lot of nutrition out of a shark, I guess, and it was a bit of a trophy. So they get the muskets, but they don't go and shoot the shark. They go into Captain Bligh's cabin. He always had his door unlocked, so he was available at any hour of night or day, and they grab him.
Well, in the 84 movie, they get that pretty well right, don't they? It happens at night, and whereas the other two, 35 and 62, it all happens conveniently in daylight, so that they can film it and have it happening. And
certainly the Marlon Brando one, they have a sailor who's drunk seawater, don't they? And he has to give him fresh water.
Yeah, that's the breaking point.
And they have Bligh saying,
in 62,
"Take that water below, don't give it to him."
And in the 62 one, Bligh strikes Christian on deck in broad daylight, and then Christian for once snaps and strikes him back.
Yeah.
And the Trevor Howard Bligh, thinks that's great because now he can arrest Christian, and that's the trigger for the mutiny in the 62 one. So,
and none of them have the phrase that's apparently never actually been said of, "Is this mutiny, Mr. Christian?" I think it's one of those, like the Michael Caine in Zulu, "Don't you throw them bloody spears at me." It's never been said, and it's not true. But you do have, I think, the 84, and whatever I think of Mel Gibson as a director, as an actor, he does portray anguish very well, the conflicted character, and it does seem that Christian was desperate, and he almost got carried away with the events, and suddenly confronted by his old friend and commanding officer, the reality hit, and this is where you hear this phrase repeatedly, "I am in hell, I've been in hell for weeks." And you have Bligh saying, "I'll pawn my honour, if I ever speak of this again, just put your weapons down." But he wasn't creeping, he was defiant, and that comes out in the 84 film. And also, he's almost trying to goad these sailors, but I think Bligh would have expected a very robust resistance from the Royal Sailors. And what is apparent is no one really did anything.
What do you mean?
To retake the ship from the mutineers.
Oh, yeah, well,
I think Bligh's assuming this is 4 or 5 disaffected sailors and officers. Why is everyone else just stood looking?
Yeah. Well, there weren't many people on board. It was 40-something sailors.
Yeah, 45, 46
45.
sailors.
And apparently when the mutiny is afoot, Christian was surprised as to how many sailors wanted to remain loyal and sail off into...
Well, once they've taken a ship and made sure that arms were only handed out to people they knew were on board or on side with them.
Yep.
And they were going to launch the ship's cutter, which was worm-ridden and too small and inadequate. And a lot of people claim credit for Peter Hayward Dars, James Morrison, both of whom stayed aboard the Bounty as, in their words, reluctant mutineers or reluctant stayers. But they got the ship's launch, 23 feet long, 6 foot 9 inches wide, 2 foot 9 inches deep at the
Probably made
midpoint.
for 10 people or something?
Yeah, 8 to 10.
And they had
4 to 6 oars, single mast with a jib and a mainsail.
Yeah.
And they launched that, but this takes a couple of hours.
Right.
So there's a lot going on. John Smith, who is barely noticed in any of the films, he is mentioned in the 84 film, he's played by John Sessions, is Bligh's secretary, his clerk.
Right.
He did a fantastic job. He managed to get a lot of Bligh's journals, his ship's log, his sextant that was broken, a quadrant and a compass, and get it all aboard the cutter. And then he just got in and sat there, making it absolutely clear, I'm going with my captain.
And now there's 19 people in this small boat.
Yeah, and Fletcher Christian, according to accounts from both mutineers and loyalists, was shocked that many people actually wanted to go in an open boat faced with the Pacific.
Almost certain death.
What to Christian, I mean, I can only imagine in the real Fletcher Christian's mind, his idea of Captain Bligh was very much as the Hollywood movies have all portrayed him, as a tyrant. And I just think he was... several accounts of his character come from other naval officers who he'd served under in earlier ships, and they said, yeah, there was nothing really that impressed me about him. He seemed to be... he lacked wholeheartedness in everything he did, other than the pursuit of pleasure. So he could well have been a bit of a...
Playboy.
Yeah.
Well, talking about pursuit of pleasure, the 84 film has Fletcher Christian going back to the island for a minute, to Tahiti, getting tattooed like the Tahitians did, and he gets his rump, his rear side tattooed, and apparently that's correct. Christian did that in real life.
Yeah, and so did a lot of the other sailors.
Some of them
claimed they were loyalists and were just waiting for the next Navy ship to pick them up. I think Peter Hayward had his buttocks tattooed. He had a star tattooed on his chest.
Okay. Okay, so we've got 19 people sailing off from the Bounty. We've got 20-something remaining on board.
And only about 12 to 14 of them willing mutineers.
So there's a half dozen or so who wanted to go with Bligh, but there was simply no room, and so they had to stay on board. And what's the reality of Bligh acknowledging that they were not mutineers?
Well, this is interesting. None of the movies have him saying this, and we're about to play Bligh's parting shot to the ship from each of the 3 films, because I think it's worth looking at or listening to the differences in portrayal. What he actually did was called out that there was a lull apparently as the launch went off. Probably the guys on board the Bounty thinking, we've done it now, what happens next? And there was a silence fell, and into that silence Bligh stood up in the back of the launch, waved his hat and said, "Never fear, my lads, I'll do you justice if ever I reach England."
Right.
Now the people staying on board who wanted to go with him say, well, I know we absolutely understood what he was saying. Don't worry, I'll let them know you were reluctant to stay and you're innocent. The mutineers all interpreted that as, if he gets back to England, we're done for. He's going to come after us with all the might of the Royal Navy. What he actually meant, we don't know. He just says he gave them a greeting, a farewell, as cheerful as he could muster in the circumstances. That's in his account.
Okay, so Bligh is... sailing westward. West, yeah. And in I think all 3 of the movies at this point in time, we see the jubilant mutineers joyfully throwing out the breadfruit plants. That was the purpose of the whole journey.
Yeah.
And that really happened.
Yeah, they threw the breadfruit overboard.
Immediately.
It was the hated fruit.
Yeah.
So what we'll do now, we'll just listen to, first of all, Charles Lawton. He sounds quite annoyed.
Casting me adrift 3,500 miles from a port of call, you're sending me to my doom, eh? Well, you're wrong, Christian. I'll take this boat as she floats to England if I must. I'll live to see you, all of you, hanging from the highest yard arm in the British fleet.
So that was Charles Lawton getting really angry. Next we're going to hear Trevor Howard from 1962.
Yeah.
Just as angry, but delivering that anger in a far more menacing and calm manner. So here is the wonderful Trevor Howard.
Has your murderous friend told you what to expect, or is he going to keep you in the dark? Now hear the truth. The King's Navy will not rest until every mutineer is captured and executed. Wherever you go, wherever you hide, 1,000 ships will search you out. I'm not leaving you, Mr. Christian. Not ever. Go to the dirtiest little corner of the world. I'll be there, right behind you, with a rope in my hand.
Oh, that is just wonderfully creepy.
Creepy, yeah.
Yeah.
And so now we've got the final farewell from Anthony Hopkins Bligh in the 84 movie Bounty.
Yeah, in my opinion, he just plays the part brilliantly. An absolute stiff-necked disciplinarian, but I do think they make him a reasonably fair one. Anyway, this is Anthony Hopkins' take on Bligh's departure.
Really think you'll be able to command this rabble? I'll do my best. Well, I did my best. And I had the authority of the law. You're a dead man, Fletcher. Dead man, sir. On the boat, sir. Quick, not seen the last of me, Ned Young. Take my word for it. Thank you, Mr. Lamb. Nor you, John Adams. Not seen the last of me. I wouldn't wager on it. You should see, sir. I'll see you hang.
So again, more in line with Trevor Howard, the threat to see people hang and the I'll be seeing you again. Interestingly, John Adams, who he said there, I'll see you again, and John Adams replied with, I wouldn't wager on it, wouldn't have actually been known as John Adams on the Bounty. He was there under a pseudonym, Alexander Smith, possibly because he skipped from another naval ship onto theirs. It was called a purser's name, a bit like joining the French Foreign Legion. But John Adams we'll come back to towards the end.
Okay. So now we've got two narratives to follow.
Yeah, now we could go into enormous detail here, and if anybody wants to know more, I cannot recommend Lieutenant Bligh's account highly enough. It's incredibly factual. Bear in mind, even though it was written by one of the protagonists, it's not about who was right, who was wrong. This is about the voyage in a 23-foot launch. And seriously, folks, measure out 23 feet in your living room and imagine being in that space, 23 by 6 foot.
19 people,
19
plus provisions.
With provisions, with a tool chest. The carpenter, William Purcell, who'd caused all that problems earlier, he went aboard with Bligh and managed to take his
equipment,
toolbox with him. What they weren't allowed to take, and this is what I find staggering, is any charts. Fletcher Christian said in the 84 film, he says, I need the charts. And this is apparently quite true. He did not allow them to take any charts. So William Bligh he could fix where he was with the use of the quadrant and the compass, but he had to navigate effectively from memory. And he was heading for East Timor, which was over 3,600 miles away across the Pacific.
Well, both the earlier movies suggest that Christian was fairly magnanimous and gave maps and tools and at least a compass to help Bligh survive, but in reality they were a bit tougher on him. Yeah,
and the account actually says that it was John Smith who got those stuffs, Bligh's clerk.
Yeah.
Now, very early in the first few days, because they were given provisions for 5 to 7 days on full rations. Now, obviously, they're going to reduce that. They would subsequently survive for over 45 days.
Yeah.
They were not given anywhere near enough rations. Now, some of the mutineers are alleged to have remonstrated with Christian, with Fletcher Christian said, "Why on earth did you let him live?" He said, "I haven't let him live. I've cast him adrift in the Pacific in an open boat." And they said, no, that man could survive. If anyone could survive, that man could survive. So even though you had no doubt about Bligh's capabilities, but Christian probably couldn't bring himself, and apparently that the mutineers, when they had agreed on it, however short notice it was agreed on, had said, "We will not become murderers."
Right.
They said they weren't going to kill anyone. Although that's effectively what they could have ended up doing.
Yeah.
So quite early, the ship's launch lands at an island to provision. They were there for a couple of days, but they have a run-in with increasingly aggressive natives, and this is almost perfectly portrayed in
84?
In the 84 movie, The Bounty.
I think it's 65 as well, where they escape by the skin of their teeth and by throwing the coats into the ocean.
That's
to distract,
right, that's exactly what they did.
To distract the aggressive natives.
But they had a rope holding the ship, the boat to the shore, and some natives were trying to pull it ashore.
That's right.
And they were clacking stones together. Apparently they were very, very expert stone throwers.
Right.
That was one of their main distance weapons.
And they lost someone, didn't
John
they?
Norton, who was a quartermaster's mate, he went to chop the rope and shouted to Mr. Bligh, "Get on board, sir, get on board." And very courageously went waving in with a cutlass, but he was hit by a stone, stunned, and the rest of them had to watch his head being caved in with stones. So Bligh cut the rope. This is the 84 version, but this is true as well.
62 as well. 62 as well, I think.
Bligh cuts the rope with his pocket knife, and they set off to sea. They're pursued by canoes, which they distract by throwing clothing overboard.
Yep.
So the canoes stop to scoop up their trophies.
And I don't know whether he'd made his mind up to sail for Timor before that incident, or whether that certainly sealed his fate, and let's not try and negotiate with natives, let's just head for the nearest European colony.
Yeah, he recorded in his log that some of the men said, "Well, why don't we go back to Tahiti? That's a lot closer. It's 1,000 miles, but it's not nearly 4,000. And he said, "We can't go back to Tahiti," because they all assume that's exactly where the Bounty's gone. So they goes, "We're unarmed." They were given 4 cutlasses, but no firearms. The detail we don't need to go into here of this journey, but it is incredible, and it was at that stage probably the foremost survival story from Britain's centuries of naval exploration. And it really fired people's imaginations at home when they heard about it.
It really is the most amazing aspect of the story, and not the mutiny itself, which was the catalyst, but the fact that they sailed, treacherous, stormy, and at times very stormy seas for 45 days.
And the 84 film portrays something they did, which was who gets this game. Well, it's not really a game, but it's a method of distributing. They catch seagulls.
Yeah, one of the others.
Somehow, or fish.
Yeah.
And Mr. Cole, the quartermaster, who's loyal throughout to Bligh, really admirably loyal. It was his job to cut up a piece of meat with his back turned, so no one else could see what piece of meat it was, how big it was, and he would call out, "Who shall have this?" And Captain Bligh would just say, "Mr. Purcell." So he'd get the next bit, so no one knew who was going to get the good or the bad bits.
Right.
And it is shown in that Mr. Purcell, who was a cantankerous git, the carpenter, even in the open boat. In the 84 film, it shows him whining that Captain Bligh's getting the best bits, and Bligh gives him his ration.
Look, after seeing all 3 films more than once, I'm a bit muddled, but I'm certain that at least one of the earlier films portrays Bligh as doing something noble as far as the rations go to protect the men. So, there's some element of truth to that.
And the final thing I want to say before we get on to the aftermath and their arrival is part of Bligh's original brief was to chart the Endeavour Straits. He's in an open launch with these men. Keeping a journal, and
he
went and charted as effectively as he could where the reefs were in the Great Barrier Reef, the Endeavour Straits, where there was good landing points, and he kept a journal every day in an open boat, sometimes in rain and storms. Just mind-boggling, the man's dedication to duty. They get to East Timor, they haven't lost another man. Unfortunately, on East Timor, it's a tropical island, malaria was prevalent. They lost 4 or 5 of his men before they set off back to England. And at this stage, maybe he is open to criticism, because he basically abandons them.
Yeah.
Once they're safe in a Dutch colony, he says, "Right, I'm off back to England," and he just goes, leaves Mr. Fryer to organise everyone else's passage back.
Yeah.
They get to Batavia.
Now Jakarta.
Now Jakarta. He actually buys a boat to make that journey on a receipt, basically on his recognisance as a Royal Naval captain. He doesn't have the cash, I don't think. They get to Batavia. He jumps on a Dutch packet going back to England, gets back to England, and that's really the first people know of it. And looking back to Trevor Howard's threatening Captain Bligh's, or Trevor Howard's portrayal of Captain Bligh's last words of 1,000 ships will hunt you. The Admiralty certainly took it seriously, because we then had HMS Pandora, a 24-gun frigate, very quickly dispatched, not with William Bligh on board, he was recuperating, dispatched to Tahiti to round up as many of the mutineers as they can.
Well, bizarrely, in the 35 movie, they portray the captain of the Pandora that comes back to Tahiti to figure out what went on with the mutiny and if anyone's still there. That's captained by Bligh again. So we have this scene where Bligh appears and confronts some mutineers on Tahiti, and some of whom claim to have been loyal, and he doesn't want to know them, and so that's a bizarre plot twist. The ship is called the Pandora, and that actually did come to get them.
HMS Pandora is the ship, but her captain was Edward Edwards,
right,
whose parents I can't admire for their imagination, calling their son Edward Edwards.
The Pandora then captures some of all the mutineers on Tahiti, but I guess we're getting ahead of ourselves.
We need to go back now. And the funny thing is, the 84 film pretty much finishes here.
Yeah, that's right.
It. Bligh's made it back to... They don't show him going back to England, except they do show the round-up of the court-martial. Right. Because he was court-martialed, any naval captain is if his ship runs aground or is lost. And he was acquitted and given huge praise. Now, Laurence Olivier in the 84 film plays Admiral Hood. He didn't actually preside over William Bligh's court-martial, but Edward Fox's character, Captain Greetham, who was the naval's judge advocate, he did. And he was fulsome in his praise. And Bligh would receive his long-awaited promotion to captain as a result.
Well, I think...
But we'll wrap up with Bligh shortly. I think what we need to do now is go back to the HMS Bounty after they threw the launch off. So back to the Bounty. Once they watched the launch go, lots of shouts were heard from the men in the launch coming from HMS Bounty of Huzzah for Tahiti, which is how they pronounced Tahiti then. They did in fact go back to Tahiti.
They did.
Christian landed, and when the king said, "Oh, where's Bligh?" he said, "Oh no, he's starting a new settlement on some nearby islands. We could do with some men to help and some provisions, and maybe some women could come along to cook or whatever."
Yep.
And they got wholehearted support from the Tahitians. Yeah, great. Got them on board. Then headed 500 miles south of Tahiti.
Yeah, and they lured some Tahitians to join them on the Bounty. Under the rubric of starting a new colony with Bligh
already
there, and Cook was suggested that Cook was there as well.
Yeah,
and so they sail off and they find a possible home for them all on the island of Tabuai, and for 2 months they try and establish a settlement there, but the increasingly hostile Tabuans make their life hell, and after 2 months they decide to abandon that venture and are going to have to find another home. And at this stage, the mutineers are torn between, let's just go back and live the Tahitian good life, versus, no, we'll get arrested if we go back there, let's find an alternative hiding place somewhere in the South Pacific.
Yeah. So they go back to Tahiti, they don't land the ship, or they don't bring the ship very close in. The reception's much cooler, as either they've got word somehow through the island grapevine, or they suspect.
Yeah.
Now 15 of the party disembark. These are the reluctant crew who prefer to go with Bligh, and also some of the mutineers say, "No, I'm staying here." And it's portrayed in the 84 film with Charles Churchill saying, "Fletcher, I'm going to stay here, mate." But it's all parted on good terms. Far from the truth, apparently.
Yeah,
a lot of tension.
I think the earlier two movies don't mention this back and forward. They pretty much compress all the action to say the mutineers sail off and find a safe haven in the South Pacific.
Yeah.
Pitcairn Island, as it turns out.
What he actually did was there were, I think, 12 women and 6 Tahitian men, who were on board under pretense of... one of the women had a baby girl with her. This was under the disguise of inviting them for a dinner on board, and Fletcher Christian actually just let slip the anchor, didn't weigh the anchor, just let it slip and go. Joseph Coleman, who had not been a mutineer, a loyalist who'd been kept on board because of his skills as armourer, said, I'm going ashore with the other 15. Fletcher Christian said, no, you're not, I need you.
Yeah.
And as they sailed, he dived overboard and actually swam to Tahiti, however far offshore, on a mile at least, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
And he made it ashore, so he's like, no, I'm not going with you, son.
So of the original 20-something mutineers, we're down to 9 or 10 on the Bounty now?
9, including Christian.
Right.
Plus 6 Tahitian men, and 12 or 13, or 12 women and a girl, or 11 women and a girl.
And what do they do? Which way do they head?
They head off, I'd have to refresh my memory on the direction, the compass direction, but it's certainly to Pitcairn Island. Now, he did have an idea that there was a misplaced island.
Right.
They had some idea. Now, in the 84 film, it has him realising that the only thing that's recorded is latitude, not longitude. But actually, when they went thinking it might be suitable from the writings they'd read in one of Bligh's ship's books
journals
about the previous discovery of it, and they go to that position, and
it's not
some of the mutineers start doubting Fletcher Christian's ability as a navigator, and he said, look, we are definitely in the right place.
Yeah, it should
the
be
island
here.
Isn't. But it does appear that at that stage he said, hang on, let's not get too upset, because if we can find it and it's been misplaced on the charts, no one else is going to be able to find it.
Yeah, so every British naval chart has got Pitcairn Island
about 300 miles
from where it should be. And from earlier voyages, they know that Pitcairn is uninhabited and seems to have all the right things, got water and food, and no hostile natives to deal with. So it's an attractive prospect.
No natural harbour or landing point. That's going to discourage ships from landing groups there.
Yeah.
So they take the Bounty there, run her ashore.
So in another,
John Adams, who we mentioned earlier, who's one of this party, and he was the last survivor of this group, and he was interviewed by many naval captains, American whaler captains over the years, and every time told a slightly different story. Who ordered the ship burned? We don't know. Sometimes he said it was Fletcher Christian, sometimes he said it was done despite Christians.
Well, yeah, you've gotten to a key moment, it's a contentious moment, but once they get to Pitcairn and they can see it's got real potential to be a home for them, at some stage the Bounty is burnt. Yeah. Right? And
they salvage what they can.
Yeah, and I think the common wisdom now is that they salvaged what they could and they burnt it, so there would be no marker and no opportunity to go anywhere else, and force them to make a home there. In the 62 film, they portray this event by having Fletcher Christian, Marlon Brando, decide he wants to do the right thing and be a good sailor, a good naval sailor, and after having mutineered and gotten them to Pitcairn, turns around and says, this is the wrong thing, lads. We need to go back to England and we need to face justice. Let's do the right thing. And at that stage, one of the other mutineers that doesn't agree with him sets fire to the Bounty, and trying to save the Bounty, the Marlon Brando Fletcher Christian catches fire and burns and dies on screen just after they land in Pitcairn.
Whoops. Again, what actually did happen to the Bounty being burnt and to Fletcher Christian, there were various different accounts, but it does say most historians agree that the likeliest thing, they landed there in January 1790.
There you go.
So it was about 8 months after the actual mutiny itself. 11 Tahitian women, a young girl and 6 men. Conflicts immediately started because Christian divided the land up into 9 parcels. The island was divided into 9 plots
for each
British man. Because they just seemed to assume that they'd have the pick of the women, and the 6 Tahitian men would act as their servants, which, particularly as they'd been taken there under false pretences, they weren't too happy about. So
there was resentment amongst the mutineers, and then between some of the mutineers and the Tahitians.
Definitely. And conflict breaks out, and in September 1793, Fletcher Christian and 4 of the other mutineers are murdered by the Tahitian men, who were in turn murdered, some by the surviving 4 mutineers and some by the Tahitian wives of the dead mutineers. Christian fathered a son called Thursday October Christian, and apparently the records say that he should have been called Friday because he was born on a different day. I'm not sure how they know that or why it's important. And he did have other children as well. So all we had left was John Adams and Ned Young, who was the only sort of officer amongst this group. Matthew Quintal, portrayed in the 1984 film by Neil Morrissey from Men Behaving Badly, for people who watch British comedy series, and McCoy. McCoy and Quintal construct a still and make liquor and get drunk all the time.
That's correct. Is that shown in 84, the 84 film?
No, none of this. No,
it just ends with
the bounty being burned.
And
then it just says, Pitcairn Island still occupied today by the ancestors of Fletcher Christian and the mutineers, which is true. But McCoy committed suicide in 1798. Quintal then started becoming combative again. So Adams and Young killed him. Adams then dies of asthma in 1800. Ned Young dies of asthma in 1800, and John Adams actually teaches
saves the day.
Yeah, he
converts a Christian colony
to Christianity,
and they observe the Sabbath on a Sunday.
They teach them to read and write in English. Teaches them that their sovereign lord is King George of England. And in 1808, an American whaler or sealer ship called Topaz docks, and they're met by a man claiming to be called Alexander Smith. It's actually John Adams, from 46 islanders, most of them young. And Adams went on to live till 1831. He was visited by the Royal Navy, who all went back and reported he's doing a fine job.
1814, the British come and confirm the rumours that one mutiny is still alive, and that there is this fledgling colony on the other side of the world.
And he'd give these visiting captains gifts from the Bounty, a telescope or a ship's log that hadn't been filled in yet but was embossed with her name and a date. So they knew it was absolutely genuine.
So by 1814, it's 35 years since the mutiny.
Yep.
And it seems no justice needs to be served. The remaining mutineer was not arrested or tried or anything. Just left him in his spot.
The Admiralty seems to have actually taken quite a humane view of, if we take John Adams away, these islands have no patrician.
Yeah.
He's actually guiding them. So maybe we just leave him there. He's not exactly a danger to British society,
And to this day, Pitcairn Island remains a British territory?
Yeah, in the 1800s, the population was up to 208. Pitcairn was no longer big enough to support them, so they moved them to Norfolk Island, where some of the ancestors still live.
Yeah.
But within 18 months or so, a lot of Ned Young's family and some of his Fletcher Christians, about 20 of them, have gone back to Pitcairn. They're still there today. You can visit Pitcairn Island, tourist board.
And Norfolk Island.
But Adamstown, named after John Adams, of course, the capital, smallest capital in the world on Pitcairn, but the population of the island is about 50, and their average age is over 50. They're worried the island's going to die out. There was a sex scandal there in the early 2000s. Where they were tried in New Zealand. They were tried for underage sex with girls, and they said, well, our age of consent is 12, and New Zealand were like, nah, it's not anymore. So it's strange, but incredible place.
Well, what about Bligh's story then, if that brings Fletcher Christian to an end?
So Bligh gets back to England, he's court-martialed, he's acquitted, he's promoted to captain, but when the other mutineers arrive back and rumours start coming around that maybe he's not quite, or there were maybe some things that he wasn't the nice guy that maybe
the hero he initially was
was
portrayed after the Timor voyage.
But by then he's already been given HMS Providence and HMS Assistant, or HMAV.
He's promoted to what?
Promoted captain.
So
he's now officially a post captain. And he takes the Providence is a 24-gun frigate, takes it back to Tahiti to fulfil the breadfruit mission.
Yeah.
Now, of course, by the time he gets there, the mutineers that were picked up by the Pandora have been and gone. So Bligh's actually away for their court-martial.
Yeah.
So, because Edward Edwards, and he picks up 14 mutineers. Some voluntarily give themselves up, some have to be captured, rounded up. They then run aground in Endeavour Strait.
Yeah.
Because, of course, they've left before they've been able to read Bligh's journal about it.
Yeah.
And they're shipwrecked. 4 of the mutineers, 4 of the Bounty crew are killed during the shipwreck. The rest make another open boat voyage, much shorter this time, but they get back to England. They're court-martialed, and the Caroline Alexander goes into great depth and very. I don't mean that as a criticism. She examines the likelihood of, they all claim to have been loyalists or they were forced. Matthew Burkitt has a very poor job or hard job doing that, because he was one of the guys who went down with a musket and grabbed Bligh.
Well, just to backtrack a bit to the sinking of the Pandora, that does make it into the 35 movie, and it does accurately portray that some of the mutineers that are incarcerated beneath deck don't manage to get released and drown, but some of them do get released by their jailers and manage to swim to safety. But so that's a big tick for them getting that right. But just remember, in the movie, Captain Bligh is on the Pandora as the captain.
Yeah.
You know, so
The other thing is the 84 film makes no address of that at all. You don't see anything about the mutineers. You might say it in headlines at the end. I think 3 of them were hanged.
Well, that movie is called The Bounty, unlike the other two, The Mutiny on the Bounty. So I suppose they just ended the narrative when the bounty ceases to be.
Yeah,
maybe.
I guess, or they ran out of money. So 10 come back to be court-martialed. Coleman, the man who leapt overboard the Bounty and swam to Tahiti as Fletcher Christian left for the last time, he's acquitted. Norman, who was the botanist, I think. Mackintosh and Byrne. Michael Byrne was a partially blind fiddler who is portrayed in the 84 film. Now they'd all been, Bligh left a deposition saying those 4 men all wanted to come with me. They were forced to remain because there was no more room. So their acquittal was pretty much done and dusted. The other 6 are all convicted and sentenced to death. However, as part of the sentence, the court recommended clemency for Peter Hayward, the midshipman with the aristocratic connections, James Morrison, who was literate and had left a very lengthy journal, including a study of the Tahitian people for the near year he'd had there, which was fascinating and very, very well done, and he got a lot of praise for that, through which he got some connections. And they are both they're both pardoned by the king, and they both continued their Royal Naval careers. And Peter Hayward ended up a captain. The other 4, Muspratt, who was definitely guilty of being a willing mutineer, had money to hire a lawyer who appealed. During the process of his appeal, the remaining 3, Burkitt, Millward and Ellison, were all hanged from the yardarm of HMS Brunswick in Portsmouth Harbour. That was October 79. A couple of weeks later, Muspratt hears he's been pardoned too. Why is not quite clear. Right. And immediately people in England, even at that time, said, well, it would appear that you can be a mutineer so long as you've got connections, and then they'll get you off the hanging. Well,
the 35 movie sort of compresses all of that down to the trial of the Byam character that is a replacement for Peter Hayward, and the Byam character is found guilty and pardoned by the king and resumes a successful naval career, which partly based in truth for the Peter Hayward character then.
Bligh, when he on HMS Providence with his little sloop alongside the HMS Assistant, which I just think is a great name for a ship it's a brig. He completes his journey from Tahiti to the West Indies, and Puerto Rico, the island of Puerto Rico, still have breadfruit amongst their locally grown staple foods. So I suppose that's thanks to William Bligh.
It didn't take off anywhere near they hoped, and it was a bit of a
failure at first. Refused to eat it.
Yeah, but eventually it became part of the food scene, and in that respect, the mission was successful.
Yeah, he got back to England. Bligh, and found out that suddenly he was no longer the hero. People were already starting to use his name as a byword for despotic.
Yeah, the counter propaganda starts. I think.
Yeah, Edward Christian, Fletcher's older brother, was a very successful lawyer, teaching law in Cambridge. He got a group of like-minded thinkers. Fletcher Christian went to school with William Wordsworth. He had some people who knew how to use the power of the pen on his side, and the
narrative starts to change in favour of the mutineers and against Bligh.
Absolutely. Now, we mentioned earlier as one of our sources Sir James Barrow's 1831 account. James Barrow was quite closely related to Peter Heywood, who died around 1831 as a captain, and he also quite harshly criticises Bligh for his tyrannical ways, his lack of sympathy for the men and empathy. And really, Hollywood have continued that. Caroline Alexander as one of the... there are 2 or 3 accounts out there, but from the recommendations I read, hers is seen as the most well-rounded. She doesn't say Bligh was an absolute hero. She accepts there are no black and whites, it's shades of grey, and he had flaws, but she's quite adamant that Peter Heywood was a thoroughly willing and active participant in the mutiny, but not to the point of being obvious to everyone he was. So he's probably hedging his bets to see which way the wind will blow. He then takes a wife, starts a plot, him and George Stewart, that name again. George Stewart died on board the Pandora, but he goes back to when it foundered in Endeavour Strait. But Peter Heywood, she's convinced, was guilty as sin, but he got off because he had connections.
Okay, so Bligh's reputation starts to take a turn for the worse to some degree. He still remains, favoured in the naval
Well, the Admiralty shut him out a bit.
Didn't they give him some Admiralty position right towards the end of his life?
Oh, no, he's now waiting for his next command.
Right.
He waited 19 months. His lieutenant from the journey on the Providence, they worked very well together. Bligh had picked up an illness, we think probably malaria, in East Timor, and he kept having recurring bouts, and he actually handed command to his lieutenant twice during the Providence's journey from England to Tahiti, then to the West Indies and back. They worked very well together, they were full of praise for each other, but his lieutenant got another gig within a few months. He waited 19 months before he was appointed to a ship, but after that it appears that it was pretty much put behind everybody. He was with Nelson at the Battle of Copenhagen, and Nelson referred to him as his second in command. He commanded a 54-gun battleship at that battle, acquitted themselves very well. He was involved in the Nore Mutiny, which followed the Spithead Mutiny, but you can't hold that against Bligh. That was 100 ships mutinied, and he was one of the captains who were very politely invited to leave his ship by his men, not, threatened with violence.
So he touches on mutiny, a second mutiny, which, as you say quite rightly, he's not really responsible for. But then he's entrusted to be, I think, the 3rd governor of the fledgling colony of Australia.
New South Wales.
Which
was a huge cut territory then. That included Queensland, what's now Queensland, Victoria, Northern Territories. It was basically New South Wales was.
But at that stage, I don't even think they'd settled on Tasmania. I think it was pretty much the Sydney Cove colony. And is responsible for prompting the only armed rebellion in Australia's history.
The Rum Rebellion.
I'm probably ignoring the Eureka Stockade there. So definitely the first armed rebellion, and it's when he comes in as the new governor of the colony and decides to cut the rum ration of the naval officers underneath him.
It's interesting you say that, because Caroline Alexander's got quite a different take on it. He went in there and realised that the officers had awarded themselves a massive rum ration, not because they liked drinking rum, which they probably did, because they were selling it. They were selling it to the settlers. There was a hugely corrupt pocket-lining endeavour going on. Bligh came in, realised what was going on, shut it down, because one thing you can tell through Bligh's entire career, he is brutally honest with everybody, including himself. Shades of Nicky Lauder there, going back to episode 2 in Rush. But he is a hard taskmaster to himself, but he expects everyone else to meet his standards. They deposed him and incarcerated him offshore on a ship where he considered himself the reigning governor in exile.
Yeah.
And he got nothing but praise from the British government for the way he conducted himself, for his initial actions. The officers involved were court-martialed, taken back to England, and either cashiered or imprisoned. So actually, but I read a internet article, which is why we don't use the internet except for routes to sources, that said, "Oh no, he got there and he was so tyrannical," and that I think it was written by an Australian.
Yeah, that's the
freedom lover.
That's the popular view in Australia, that he was a tyrant.
He came in as this man. I mean, I'm not being funny, but the term, or to think of oneself as an Australian, was probably at least 50, 60 years away,
much
if
later,
not
much later.
More than that. They were British.
First World War, 1901 Australia became independent, and I think even in the First World War they were fighting as under Mother England.
So I loved watching Charles Lawton.
Yeah, great entertainment.
I love watching Trevor Howard. Marlon Brando, less so.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed the 84 film. I saw it when it came out. I remember thinking, it was the first time I was aware of Anthony Hopkins as a screen presence. I remember thinking, wow, we've got another Richard Burton here with his charisma and his presence. And then turns out that they were both grew up in adjoining Welsh mining villages. I really enjoyed it. It's closer to the fact,
84.
but none of them.
Well, I think the two earlier ones have taken a lot of license and historically would be a fail.
Yeah.
I think the 84 one is much closer to the truth and would definitely be a pass. Whether it's a perfect grade or not, I don't know. The first one and the last one are very entertaining.
Yeah.
Really gripping.
And the score by Vangelis in the 84 film is haunting.
I think generally the middle one, 62, is seen as, the flop.
It's 3 hours.
It's 3 hours.
3 hours of your life you're never going to get back.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what they were thinking. I don't think the screenwriter is someone whose books I'll be hunting down to read.
No.
For 35, 7 out of 10 for entertainment, 5 for historical accuracy, maybe 4.
Yeah.
The Marlon Brando one, 6 for entertainment, and 3
for history.
Yeah,
below 5.
Now, Alex von Tonzelman, if anyone is interested in this, in getting much shorter versions of what we're doing, writes a great column in The Guardian called Real History, real spelled REL. She's a historian and a film buff, and she gives this as the 84 film C for entertainment, because she does find it quite tedious, and a B plus for history. So I'd be tempted to say 7
right.
out of 10 for the history and probably 8 out of 10
for the entertainment.
Yeah,
that all sounds good.
But on April the 28th, I'll work out through the time zone magic what the time would be around Tahiti. I might raise a glass, but I'll be raising my glass to Lieutenant William Bligh.
Yeah, I agree. Me too.
So to look forward, in 2 weeks' time, Bridge of Spies, which is the recent Tom Hanks film, 2013, I think.
Sounds about right.
So we're going from the South Pacific and the pre-Napoleonic era to the sort of early years of the Cold War, the middle years of the Cold War.
Great.
All right, thanks everybody.
Cheers.